trying to position ourselves to understand something important. And the most common way to describe what this is that's important is how do we come to have an interior world? How is it that we experience a world inside of ourselves? Why is that so? And why would it be the case that men and women of wisdom traditionally have said that the world inside is as coextensive as the universe outside? That is to say, not only do we have just feelings inside, and thoughts inside, and awarenesses inside, but that there's a whole planet of experience inside. And further than that, there are whole star systems inside. There are collections of star systems inside that are whole galaxies. And there's a whole universe of galaxies inside. Now you can imagine that to someone who just barely experiences rudimentary feelings, like, dislike, anger, annoyance, want, someone who has just this veneer of an inside, must view the world in a very superficial way. Because the wisdom of men and women, traditionally, is that to the extent that we developed our inner world, to that extent the outer world becomes an in-depth, rich field for experience. Now let's backtrack for just a second. Is this to say then that so-called primitive man, primordial human beings, who did not have a very developed interior world, saw the world in just a flat way? Not at all. Their development inside was tremendous. But their inner world was a world of mystical participation. That's an English pronunciation of a phrase that a Frenchman who brought this idea, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, mystical participation, that primitive men and women were so immersed in the world, they lived so completely in the world, that all the dimensions of the world were the dimensions of themselves. There was no separation of inner and outer at all. So that primitive women, primitive men, should more correctly be called primordial. There was nothing primitive about them at all. They were primordial in the sense that prime means one. They were primordial because there was a oneness. They were in the world in such a way that they were totally dissolved in the richness of the world. One could say that the world was their inner world. Nature was their inner world. There was no difference. It was the same dimension. How is it then that when we experience our inner world, or we observe others around us experiencing their inner world, this is not the case at all? What has happened? The saying is that we have, those people that we observed, they have dropped out of the world, dropped out of nature. How does this happen? So intense is this experience. So fierce is the reaction to this intense experience. So resonant is the response to that experience, that it has gained stature as a myth. The fall of man. Adam and Eve, who are expelled from the Garden of Eden. The fall from innocence. The loss of purity. So that when we begin to talk in this way, we realize that this is an extraordinarily touchy issue. Our kind were once so indissolubly a part of nature that there was no question or problem for us, but that something has happened where now the problem and the questions, when we think about them at all, when we try to think about them at all, are so puzzling, and if we pursue them and go deeper into the puzzlement, we find that they become debilitating, actually. What has happened? How does this come about? The frame of reference that we could put around this problem, this happening, the traditional frame of reference is called language. Whatever has happened has something to do with language. A quality, a style of language has happened. Language has changed from what it was initially or originally, and in its change, it has changed us so that inner and outer have become a problem. A problem because they do not interface so well, or rather, to be more precise, because they interface too well that a thin, narrow veneer of interior only elicits a thin, narrow veneer of exterior. And we feel claustrophobic. We feel scrunched. We feel trapped. And the first response to this is to try to increase the exterior world by dramatic action. Do something. And the action gives us the sense that somehow we're exploring the world, we're doing something, and we expect that this then has a correlate that we are then exploring the inner world by action and activity in the outer world. We discover that we are bottled up, we're living a boring life, And so we decide to increase this by doing things, learning to do things. We're going to become athletic. We're going to increase our sphere of action, and somehow this will then increase the inner world. It doesn't happen. Because the inner world has not occurred because of action. The inner world has occurred because of language. And only when the action is translated into language, only when our language is able to tell of the action, is there a beginning correlation of enlarging the interior world. So that this is a very curious situation. So that at some point, in between very primordial men and women who lived in a tribal situation, somewhere in between there, they learned to use language in a creative way to increase their inner world to match the outer world that was being explored by action. Now, we found in our education that when we began with nature, at the very beginning of this year, we spent 3 months on nature. We found that the wise tradition about nature was that nature is not there as things. Nature does not have existence as things. Nature is a matrix of change in constant movement. When one applies an empirical calibration of nature, one finds that seemingly solid things, when one gets down to their molecular or atomic levels, that they are not very solid at all. They're mostly movement and relationalities. And the bits that make up those, the quarks that make up the atoms, they're in constant movement. Nowhere is there any static thing against which we could push and say we have found some place secure to stay, to stand, to base ourselves. So that it is an illusion of naivete to say that nature is there. Nature is anything but there. And we found that what is actually there are the actions which we do. And so the second series of 3 months, months 4, 5, and 6, were concerned with ritual, with doing, how we do things, with action. And we found that there is objectivity. There is what we would call existence. That the objectivity of existence is not in nature, but in what we do. And remembering this now, it begins to clear us up. Because as soon as an inner world begins to develop, and in developing, it's initially very thin. It's just a film. How thin a film? When it begins, it's only one image deep. Or to put it in modern remote sensing terminology, it's 1 pixel deep film. It records only one dimension, 1 point at a time. And with such infinitesimal granulation, it's no wonder that there are no resolutions, no pictures, because there's not enough space, there's not enough dimension, not enough richness to give us even one image. And so the recourse to action to try to enlarge our world and hopefully then give us an interior actually now can be seen as a regressive movement, as a falling back on ritual. Question: what is it a regression from? Answer: it is a regression from the level of symbols. Question: it's a regression from symbols back to ritual. Well then, what is the regression? What does it go through? Answer: it goes through myth. Because not only did we spend 3 months on nature and then 3 months on ritual, we spent then 3 months on myth. And now you're beginning to appreciate we're going to spend, and we are beginning to spend 3 months on symbol. And that this sequence, nature, ritual, myth, symbol, is a sequence that is primordial. It's rather like the sequence of DNA. Once you understand that this is the phase sequence, then it begins to be possible to understand what it is that you are doing or other people are doing. It begins to clear up. But our experience in this education is that, as we said at the beginning, give it time and have patience, because there are many mysteries. Many mysteries. And we need a whole second year because there are a whole other 4 developments. And all 4 of those other developments are in a completely different realm from these first 4. They're in a realm that glibly is called, on the street, consciousness. As if people simply using the phrase knew what they were talking about. It's a quality of myth that experience is engendered. So that rituals dealt with existence and myth deals with experience. What do symbols deal with? They deal with what would be called essence. And the essence must be distilled from experience. There's a relation between essence and existence, but its relation is always mediated by experience, and experience is characterized by language. That's why this whole phase is called myth. The story that one would tell. For experience needs to have, in order to establish itself as experience, it needs to have its sequencing. Lines linearity, sequencing of experience make these threads that are myths. And in a way, the symbolic realm, the inner world, weaves these threads together to make a fabric. It's like an inner clothing. But that process, that interior process, that weaving process, is very precarious because it takes the sequencing of experience as it actually happened to us, as we put it together, and it changes it by bringing it into juxtaposition with other threads, sometimes quite different threads. And until we get used to this, we become confused every time that it happens. Because it took us a great deal of energy, a great deal of feeling investment to make experience come into those sequences, and for them to be used in some other way makes us confused, because our first tendency is to think that this new use, the weaving of it together as a fabric, should just be a continuation of one of those threads, and it isn't. Let's personify it. Here's a little thread, and it's had a hard time coming into existence. And it took you a long time to get things ordered in such a way that it made sense, that the story of this made sense. And now it's going to be juxtaposed and used in a completely different way from the way in which it was engendered, and you're reluctant to give it up. The thread says, no, I had a hard time getting here, and now you want to use me in something else and just make me a part of something else? No, I won't do it. So that a kind of a bifurcation happens, a split. The threads of experience say, we have our own order, we know where we came from, and what you're trying to use us for is antithetical to our nature. We won't do it. But what happens here is a very curious, very perilous, and very curious activity. Instead of making an inner world, instead of those threads weaving a fabric of an inner world, by digging their heels in and not going, by not interiorizing, they do a flip-flop and they exteriorize. They flee back into the world. What world do they flee back into? They flee back into the world of ritual. And instead of being integrated in symbols interiorly, they are integrated in rituals exteriorly. So that someone who is mature to the point where they could have, where they need to have, where they are ready to have an interior life that's rich, if they don't go through with that, they rebound and they have an exterior life that's a false self. And they become very good party members of the Nazi Party and things like that. We don't want to think. We don't want to have those kinds of perils and problems. And if we get together, we won't let anyone else have those, and they will not threaten us. And so a kind of a bogus self occurs in the world of action, and it's called the ego. Now, if you take a look at most of the 8,944 textbooks on psychology, they all talk about building the ego. How to build up your ego, how to increase your ego. You can find speakers across the world who are making the shekels and the disciples because they're showing you how to manifest, how to magnetize, how to really energize and get that stuff that you want and get that world that you want happening. It's all regression. Every single part of it is regressive. It's worthless. It does nothing but fortify the sense of jeopardy at someone or anyone who develops an interior self. They're the enemies. They're the outcasts. They're a danger to us. They're the aliens. And so experience, instead of being distilled into an inner world, experience is soured and canned and used for an exterior, and that exterior is organized by an ideology. And an ideology is a regressive form of ideas. Because the inner world weaves. Its fabric is woven. The weavers, the patterns are the ideas. Now the threads that are made up, the mythic threads, are largely held in their places by images. A myth moves by rollers that are images. And you can have an image base that's sufficient to move a whole cycle of myths, a whole mythology. Tremendous number of images. No one's ever computed how many images there are in an image base of a standard tribal mythology, but I would say that it must be somewhere around the tens of thousands. Somewhere in that vicinity. But they do not hold form outside of their mythic threads without having some kind of synthesizing, abstract symbol. And in the interior world, the abstract symbol positions itself, because it's interiorly, positions itself at the center. Interior symbols position themselves at the center of this movement of an image base and tend to integrate them. Symbols interiorly integrate. And this is the way that ideas then integrate images. But in the regressive form of that, the ideologies are not at the center of the image base, but they're like outside of it, like a puppet master. And because an ideology is on the ritual level, not at all on the essence level, on the ritual level, the integration is not in terms of meaning, but in terms of activity. The cohesiveness of someone is there because they are marching in a uniform And you can put parentheses around this. There are many kinds of uniforms. There are many forms to marching. I forget the Nazi word in German, conveniently, but it's a word that meant conformity. The highest compliment is that you are conforming to party regulations, to party expectations. You're being a good Nazi. And the antithetical enemy to that is someone who develops their own interior life, their own essence. And the center of that essence, the center of that interior life is one's, I think the term that has been popularized in the mid-20th century is the deep self. It used to be called the soul. Yourself, your soul, your center. But in the regressive ideological form, it is exactly your soul. It is exactly and precisely your deep self that is the enemy. And so ideological conformity is absolutely dead set against you developing your own self, finding your soul, finding your center. Out of all the don'ts in a party ideology, when you boil them down, the final don't is that you cannot be who you are. You must be who the ideology says. Not that you are, but that you must do. You don't even have that identity. You have a place. And the all-time great image of this place was brought to the attention of the world by a film which Charlie Chaplin made called The Great Dictator, where the little tramp gets a job in the factory, in the modern factory, and there are all these gears. A cog. Because a cog does exactly the action for which it is made. And when you're a cog in the ideological machine, then you are safe and secure in your cogness. But as the little tramp found in The Great Dictator, those gears and those machines swallow someone up. Someone who tries to be just themselves. Now let's let all of this be for just a minute. Let's step back from it. Let's try to understand what's going on here. A lot of things are being said, some of them interesting, some of them maybe not accessible yet, some of them may be problematical. Let's step back a couple of steps and let's look at it. And let's look at it in this way. If you have a sequence, the most fundamental form of that sequence is a numerical counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That sequencing where you're counting is a cardinal sequencing. It's using numbers in a cardinal way. And experience has a cardinal quality to it. Its happiest, its intelligent feeling is best nourished when it knows that we've done step 1, we've done step 2, and now we're doing step 3, and we're going to look forward to step 4. And we can play with that, we can have variation, We can have steps 3B, 3C, 3D, but we don't want to move to 5 until we've done 4. So even though there's leeway and variation, experience loves cardinality. If I had a cold, it would come out carnality. Experience likes to have it line up. One of the most satisfying primordial qualities of experience is to experience the alignment. One can't have a musical sense until one has the sense of the alignment of the scale. There's something really fundamentally beautiful to experience, to be able to, for instance, sit at a piano and discover that the scale repeats itself throughout the 88 keys. And there's a C, oh well, and there's a C, and there's a C. And experience loves that. It finds out. And that the notes line up, and that there's this kind of repetition, but that there's a variation. And so experience has a cardinal quality to it, but symbols have an ordinal quality. They are different. What's an ordinal quality? An ordinal quality is that its sequencing moves by powers. 10, 100, 1,000. Symbolic essence moves by ordinal powers. One of the earliest of all of the ordinal scales of reference occurs in one of the last dialogues of Plato, called the Timaeus, heavily influenced by Pythagoras. And there's a famous diagram called the lambda. The Greek lambda is like an inverted V. And this lambda is the earliest diagram of an ordinal, symbolic sequence. At the very top of the inverted V, at the apex of the lambda, is 1. And as you move down one side of it, the increase is by squares. You go 1, 2, 4, 8. But as you move down the other side, the increase is by cubes. You move 1, 3, 9, 27. And all you need are the first indications of squares and cubes, and that the squared and the cubed meet at 1. And so in Plato's Timaeus, this Pythagorean lambda is the first written expression of the symbolic, ordinal pattern of essence. But notice here, when Plato in his earlier dialogues wants to give a convincing quality in his dialogue, he uses a myth. But in the Timaeus, when he wants to give a convincing quality, he uses a vision. Because when one moves to a symbolic interior, an ordinal quality, experience now structured by powers, myths no longer work. You have to then have vision. But the classical name for that interior realm that comes out of symbols was not vision. The classical word for it was magic. The difference between a mythic language and a magical language is that a mythic language moves by image and a magic language moves by symbol. Mathematics is a magical language. It doesn't tell you anything about the cardinal universe, but it discloses everything, eventually, that you need to know about the ordinal universe. It uses the cardinal experience as a foundation, but it quickly transcends and distills. And yes, even that woefully overworked word, transforms. So that symbols occupy a very curious kind of place. Symbols create a mind. And the mind is as objectively real as what we do. Our actions. If I pick up this cup is picked up. This is an objective action. And what is founded by this objective action is the phenomenon. By using this object in this way, it becomes what I now call cup. I not only name it cup, but it becomes phenomenally a cup. So that there is this sense that phenomena are then the foundation for mythic experience, and in that foundation allow for the process of integration. On the other hand, in an interior sense, there are no phenomenon interiorly. There are no phenomenon interiorly. But the interior objectiveness is nonetheless there, and the term for the interior object is a noumenon. Mythic experience creates phenomenon and the process by which they are integrated. And symbolic interior creates noumenon and the way in which they are differentially applicable, expressible, usable. So that when symbols are put into operation, their nature is to be differentially expressive. And this is exactly opposite of what an ideological regression does. An ideological reduction always seeks to limit what meaning can be, whereas a symbolic integration within releases a whole cosmic of possibilities. For someone who has gone inside, there are unlimited varieties of human being, and they are all real. They are all true. For those who have regressed back into one ideological stance or another, their favorite handle is to say, you don't belong because you're different from what all of us expect to be. And the basis of condemnation is across the board. It's because you're taller than 5'5". It's because you have a different kind of pink skin. It's because you have a different way of naming God. It's because there are endless prejudice from an ideological standpoint is paradoxically completely democratic. It will choose any kind of principle to ensure that those unlike us are going to be rejected. We'll find some reason. It doesn't matter what. They will prove that your earwax is quite different from everyone else's earwax. How in the hell can we even speak to you? Much less let you eat. So that there is a definite quality of developing the interior where if the interior initial film, which is always there, it's there courtesy of nature. It's there as a natural given. But if that film is not developed into the dimensions of an interior world, that film opaques over, it solidifies, and it becomes a mirror. And the only thing that the mirror of the ego shows is the reflection of the exterior world. And the very image of the vain ego is looking at a mirror to see itself, instead of looking within itself to see a deeper experience distilled into essence. The mirror becomes the perfect symbol for that ego. Let's take a break and we'll come back. I'll say it again for the tape. Let's come back exactly where we were. We're talking about the mirror. It's not an apparent process at all. One of the great classic Zen stories of China, when the fifth patriarch Matsu was old and he was dying, he wanted to pass the lineage on to a sixth patriarch. And there were so many people studying with him, it was difficult to say who had the superior consciousness. And so he asked for a poem about the mind, and whoever had the best poem about the mind would become the sixth patriarch. He never had to deal with microphones. So all of the monks chatting, office talk, said, well, geez, everyone knows that Sang is going to be the sixth patriarch. There's no sense in us writing poems. I mean, look at him. He's the senior meditation officer. He's got it down. He's in charge. Let's see what he wrote. They posted Sang's poem up. There are always bulletin boards in these kinds of organizations. So the Zen office bulletin board had Sang's poem. And it read something like, when the mind is pure, its mirror has no dust on it. Well, the 14-year-old dishwasher, after hours, when he was finished scrubbing all of the pots and pans, and he was leaving his work, he went by the bulletin board and he saw this sign up there, and he read the poem, and he shook his head. And just then Matsu was doing a Vipassana meditation. He was walking down the corridor and he saw the kitchen boy read the poem and shake his head. No. I came over, curious, like an old Zen master would be. After he's been aloof long enough, he they get curious again about ordinary things. And he said, sort of like in a early Tang Dynasty accent, "So what's the problem with it?" And the kitchen boy said, "The mind has no mirror. Where is there any place to have dust on it?" And Matsu said, "Come with me." And he took him into the office, and he opened up the desk, and he took out his begging bowl and his formal robe, and he handed them to the boy. He said, "You're the sixth patriarch. Now you better clear out of town before they kill you." And so he took the begging bowl and he took the robe in his pristine understanding, and he went out and worked in the world for 38 years. And after he got to be decent age where people would think, well, he looks like someone, he became the sixth patriarch of Zen Buddhism, Huineng. It's not at all apparent. The most clever, the most sophisticated, the most experienced person is extraneous to the realization of the true nature of the mind. There's no way to imagine it. There's no way to guess at it. You can't fake it. You can't go by someone else's description of it. You can't do some kind of statistical survey or some kind of Schrödinger distribution of the wave function. None of that has any bearing whatsoever. It's all extraneous. Why is all of that extraneous? Why are all of these extraneous? Because the mind, in its symbolic interiorization, continues in its integration to raise the powers of ordinality until they go asymptotic. Because they don't just go 10, 100, 1,000. They go like 10, a million, a trillion, a zillion. The powers of the mind shoot off the graph. There's no way. But as they shoot off the graph, the integration of images becomes more and more dense. And about the time that you get a self-consciousness that the asymptotic quality of powers is happening, you have like a neutron star mind. And that condenses then into like a black hole. And there's no imagery that escapes whatsoever. There's nothing that one can say. And the powers of the mind are so exponentially off the graph that there's no way to convey that whatsoever. It doesn't matter if someone has an IQ like Goethe of about 200. It's extraneous. The mind of enlightenment has an IQ of infinity. It makes no difference whatsoever. So that the mirror quality of the mind is all that is apparent at the beginning. That's all that's apparent. But it's like a mirror. That silver coating on the back of that glass is an illusion. It's an illusion because it's like a projective function of experience. Experience, in order to have something to found itself on, has a phenomenal foundation, which it makes by its own activity. And so the very first interior experience is the mind experiences. Notice that the mind is not dealing mind qua mind, but mind qua feeling. The mind experiences its reflective capacity. And that's what makes it seem like a mirror. Now, this sounds like metaphysics, and actually it's not. It's just descriptive. In To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf shows us two figures, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. Mr. Ramsay has a logical mind ground down to its essential. He's a philosopher. He's an English prig philosopher. And his mind is described by Virginia Woolf in this way. It was a splendid mind, for if thought is like the keyboard of a piano, divided into so many notes, or like the alphabet, is arranged in 26 letters all in order, then his splendid mind had no sort of difficulty in running over those letters one by one, firmly and accurately, until it reached, say, the letter Q. He reached Q. Very few people in the whole of England ever reached Q. Here, stopping for one moment by the stone urn which held the geraniums, he saw, but now far, far away, like children picking up shells, divinely innocent and occupied with little trifles at their feet, and somehow entirely defenseless against the doom which he perceived. His wife and son together in the window. They needed his protection. He gave it them. But after Q, what comes next? After Q, there are a number of letters, the last of which is scarcely visible to mortal eyes, but glimmers red in the distance. Z is only reached once by one man in a generation. Still, if he could reach R, it would be something. Here at least was Q. He dug his heels in at Q. Q he was sure of. Q he could demonstrate. If Q, then is Q R. Here he knocked his pipe out with 2 or 3 resonant taps on the handle of the urn and proceeded. Then R. He braced himself, he clenched himself. Qualities that would have saved a ship's company, exposed on a broiling sea with 6 biscuits and a flask of water. Endurance and justice, foresight, devotion, skill came to his help. R is then, what is R? A shudder, like the leathern eyelid of a lizard, flickered over the intensity of his gaze and obscured the letter R. In that flash of darkness, he heard people saying he was a failure, that R was beyond him. He would never reach R. On to R. Once more. R. The lizard's eye flickered once more. This is the kind of mind that Mr. Ramsay has. He has a mind which pretends at thought. But actually is capable only of feeling intelligence in its sequencing. Now, to say only is somewhat disparaging, and it's not meant to be that way at all. Feelings intelligence is extraordinary. Many people, most people, live their entire lives on feeling intelligence. They never think. They never develop a mind. It seems to them that they have a mind, but they do not have a mind, in fact. They have the appearance of a mind, They have the image of a mind. They have the expectation that they have a mind. But having a mind is extraordinarily different. When you have a mind, you can think. And thinking is actually radically very different from the experience that one bases oneself on. Thought is extraordinarily, radically different. Its objectivity are not phenomena at all. And it does not respond to correspondences in images at all. Thought is ordinal, and it moves pneumonistically, if I can use that kind of term. Usually, what takes place as a surrogate for thought is based not on symbols, but on signs. And experience can conduct itself in a make-believe surrogate of thought using signs. Signs are images that have a referent to things. And notice here that the things that are referential to signs are reputed, are supposed to occur in nature. So that the objective thingness of nature is actually a regressive, projective quality of the mythic horizon of experience, pretending that it's thinking. Well, it's extraordinary. One would say, well, is this true? How in the world can this be true? How can this happen? And the response is, it happens all the time. In fact, most people who believe that they are thinking are engaged in this kind of activity. And one can see by a simple litmus test whether you are doing this. If you think that things are real in nature, then you're pretending to think and not really thinking. The first level of learning how to interiorize correctly is simple meditation practice of learning not to have all of this projecting going on, all of this reputed pretending going on, simply to be real. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Carl Jung writes about the first time that he had a real thought. He was a late adolescent and he was sitting on top of a rock, and he suddenly realized that he and the rock existentially were together. They were real together. And he had a moment of this mystical participation where he and the rock really were one. And he says it shocked him. Because what immediately occurred after that was an original thought: if I and the rock are one, then where is God? And immediately, because he was new at this, because he was adolescent, Jung began to have a mythic fantasy surrogate for thought, because he didn't know how to think at that time at all. And it goes on in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and some very extraordinary images came out. The purport emotionally of them was that he was threatened. He was threatened by the pressure of an unthinkable thought about God vis-a-vis him, which he repressed, and because he repressed it, he became neurotic. And he became so neurotic that he couldn't function, and one day, according to his own autobiography, he overheard his parents talking about the fact that they were going to have to commit him They're going to have to send him away because he wasn't able to function anymore at all. And he said he got shocked at this and immediately took himself into hand. And immediately, through his concentration and his reality, all of his neurotic symptoms evaporated. They were gone. And he said that was the first time that he learned the truth about neuroses. They are only real as long as you continue to believe in them. They have no substantive reality of their own at all. They have no soil to grow in, no nutrients with which to maintain themselves other than our experience level, the mythic horizon. As soon as you take their roots out of the mythic horizon and you put them in ritual, they disappear, or you put them in symbols, they disappear, one way or the other. The difference is, if you put their roots in ritual, you become rather easy game for somebody who knows how to call the shots. Whereas if you put them in your own interior, then it is you, your interior, that becomes real. It becomes real by having the correspondence of words change, so that the correspondence is no longer in a sign fashion to things, but correspondence is then by powers of meaning. And powers of meaning are like not only multiples, that is to say, complexities, but also divisionals, that is to say, ratios. So that symbols then create multiples of correspondence around an integrator. And at the same time, create ratios in the relationalities of the integrator to the image base. And that those two functions pair themselves up, and in the interface of that pair comes a presence of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. And when that self-consciousness comes into play, we recognize, there's an immediate recognition that what you thought before, what you thought who you were before, I have to say it that way, what you thought who you were before was only a mask. Wasn't you at all, but was a mask. Now, in a positive, creative way, the mask was legitimate because that mask was a sketch towards that real self which you now occupy. The difference being that the mask represented something else. The mask was an image of something else. Remember the masks that we made? A mask of food or a mask of feeling? A mask is always a mask of something else. Whereas a symbolic self-consciousness is not a representation of anything else. It's not a representation at all. It's a presentation. And what does it present? It presents itself. And when your interior, functioning both by multiples of powers of correspondence and by divisionals of ratios of the integrator symbol to that whole image base, when both those functions paired happen together and that self-conscious presencing begins to grow, the presentational quality of oneself becomes objectively very real. There's no way to doubt it whatsoever. Well, you can doubt it, but you are quite aware that the doubting is a pretense. The stronger one's self-presence is, the more that you realize that doubting it is definitely a pretense. And you can even play with it. There are many meditation forms where you can actually play with that pretense. And you convince yourself by continuing to play more and more that on many subtle levels, you can now distinguish between what is real and what is simply pretense, between what is a mask and what is oneself. Though the relationship of those two orders are so close that we carry over from the Greek words which are very similar but somehow a little bit different. The word for mask is personae, and the word for the self-conscious presencing is person. Person. And there's an enormous difference between a person and a persona. One can have many personae, many masks. A good actress is able to have many, many masks. But a good actress never confuses herself with that character, with that mask. Her person is quite distinct. Now, most actors or actresses have a very difficult time making that distinction because the interiorization, the symbol quality, the symbol world is not very enriched, it's not very deep. One of the qualities of someone who has a really good soul is that they are more and more comfortable, able to play. Rather than someone getting more and more grim because they have found their soul, one gets more and more. Yeats called it one time the gaiety of language. One learns that creatively you're quite free and you're in no danger whatsoever of losing yourself. How could you lose that? Where in this universe would it be or go, on what dimensions where it would not be presenting itself? And in a way, this is a kind of a freedom, not a freedom based on choice. Oh, I'm free because I can choose to do a lot of things, but it's a freedom based upon veracity. So that the wisdom phrase for that person 5,000 years ago already, in the 64th chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, translates into English as I am. And what I am can do is I am can do any kind of relational quality whatsoever, including exchanging itself for another. Because there's no way that multiplicity bothers it. There's no way that division bothers it. And by giving itself even completely to another, it doesn't diminish itself at all. Doesn't get it off center at all. And at that depth, the soul is completely free. There are no hindrances whatsoever, irregardless of how many dimensions, or how many universes, or how many alien spaceships, or whatever the hell. It doesn't make any difference at all. Into the Lighthouse, in this novel, there is a provisional integrator, which is the lighthouse itself. But the operative integrator is Mrs. Ramsay. The lighthouse is the integrator of the mythos of the story, the storyline. The storyline is held in its sequencing by the lighthouse. The very first section, the largest section of the first of 3 sections, is called the window, through which one can see the lighthouse. The second is called time passing, and the third is called the lighthouse. So that the lighthouse is the integrating symbol in terms of the mythos, in terms of the story. But Mrs. Ramsay is the operative symbol vis-a-vis the reader who reads the story. Now, to someone who is not able to be conscious, a conscious reader, someone who doesn't really read the novel, they're still lost in it. They're lost in the pages. They're lost in the mythos. They're still absorbed by the mythos. And to them, they're still scratching their heads. Well, geez, what does the lighthouse mean? That's someone who has not made the interior shift, has not distilled consciousness at all, is not present to themselves, is not presenting themselves in the world at all. It's a simple psychological litmus test. You give someone a novel like To the Lighthouse, and you ask them what their experience is of it. Very simple. Whereas someone who has begun to make that shift, while the lighthouse is a symbol in the mythos, in the mythic sequencing of the story, Mrs. Ramsay is the center when that mythic image bends full circle. She's at the center. In the cardinal way, the lighthouse is the last image. It's the very last image. It's the purpose of that line of development. But in the wider universe of a presentational interior realm, that those lines are in an infinite dimension, and they don't hold like bars. They curve. Just like the universe, just like time-space curves, and they curve around. And the next stage after the end is the beginning. It's like that. James Joyce, writing about the same time as Virginia Woolf and our other novel, William Faulkner, also writing in Stream of Consciousness, wrote Ulysses. We would use Ulysses, except that it's very difficult because it's huge and it takes a long time and people just don't have that much time. You barely have 5 minutes a week. Some of you barely were even able to dream about going and buying the book. Can you imagine trying to read Ulysses? But when you read Ulysses and you get to the last page and the last words of Ulysses, there's no period. And the next word after the last word is the very first word. And you're back at the beginning, and you're back in the cycle. And as James Joyce wrote to Ezra Pound, he said, now that I understand it, now I can really write something. He said, I'm going to do to Ulysses what those old mad monks did to the Gospels when they illuminated them with all the swirls, like the Book of Kells. And so he took Ulysses and he put all the swirls in. He called it Finnegan's Wake. Ulysses is like a 4-foot wave coming in, it's nice. I mean, it's a wave. Finnegan's Wake is like a 40-foot tidal wave. Surf's up, gang. And the Mahaprajna Paramita Sutra is like about a 400-foot way. If you want a boogie board, there have been human beings on this planet alone, not to mention other planets on other star systems, that have really done it in style. You can curl your toes bone white if you like. Magic Mountain's got nothing to offer on that. But what is important here is to understand, vis-a-vis to the lighthouse is a cardinal symbol at the end, and it holds the meaning of the sequence. So that the lighthouse functions as an amulet, whereas Mrs. Ramsey functions as a talisman. She integrates at the center all of the meaning so that it becomes integrated towards a center, and when meaning comes to a center like that, there is a mysterious quality where it comes in so far and rebounds back out. And an ordinal symbol acts as a talisman, and that talisman radiates differentially all of the meaning everywhere. It's not like there's a single sign-like trajectory. This meaning comes in and then comes back out. All of the meaning comes in, all of it integrates together, and then every particle of the differential meaning is the entire meaning. This is what's meant by the world of light. When someone sees in this way, William Blake said once, if you want to experience fear, I'll show you a grain of sand. If you want to experience God, I'll show you a glint of light off a leaf. In modern physics, in modern mathematics, it's called the principle of the solitone. It's that the integration, when integration really happens in reality, at a certain point where the integration reaches the powers, the ordinal powers of universal referent correspondence, the quality of language slips out of its cardinal dimensions and becomes like a mystical ocean. I used to use, 30 years ago, the English translation of the longest poem by Yevtushenko called Bratsk Station. Bratskaya means brotherly in Russian, brotherly station. It was a hydroelectric station on the Angara River in Siberia, just outside of Irkutsk. And Yevtushenko used the hydroelectric station as an opposite to the great pyramids of Egypt. That all the human effort that went into the Great Pyramid was there for only one man, the pharaoh, who would be buried there. And the hundreds of thousands of people whose effort went into that was expended on static stone to house one person. Whereas all the human effort that went into making that hydroelectric station, when the hydroelectric station was finished, it gave light back to all those people for as long as it would work. And thinking about this contrast and trying to understand Yevtushenko in the poem, as he's writing the poem, as the poem is being read, he's going through the hydroelectric station, going through Bratskaya, brotherly station. And about 2/3 of the way through the poem, he finds himself at the core of the station, which is where the big turbines are, underneath the waterfall plunge of the Angara River. The Angara River is a hell of a big river. It's about a mile wide outside of Irkutsk. And it falls, the whole mile wide of the Angara falls in a swift plunge to a series of turbines. And when Yevtushenko in the poem is down there and he feels this uncanny vibration, the only word that comes out of him is everything. And he tries to say anything, and he says everything, 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 everything. It's like a shower of gold, where every particle in the universe is everything in itself. It's purely presentational. It's not representing anything else. It's presenting itself, which is everything. And in that veracity, the deep self soul finds that it is that. Tat avam asi, thou art that. You don't have to check with anybody else for your meaning at all. You don't have to consult with anything. There's no way that you are limited. How are you going to be limited there? So that the objective reality of the symbolic world is the noumenon, not the phenomenon. And to simply think that one is thinking because you can reproduce images of phenomenon in a mental space, and you call that powers of thought, they call it visualization. You see all kinds of books on visualization. There's one lady makes millions writing books on creative realization and how to do this and how big time this is. It's cheesy. It's nothing. It's simply the transposition of imagery into a mock mind, which is a made-up projective mental space. It has nothing to do with thinking at all. And it has no bearing whatsoever on the veracity of the soul. There are all kinds of people talking about the soul as if they knew what they were talking about. I mean, there's a whole long line of bellboys in heaven saying, good God, I don't want to carry their bags. So when we're looking at symbols, operative symbols, the name of the lecture today is Operative Symbols. When we're looking at operative symbols, they function in a pair of ways, twin ways. That's why someone who is in the spirit in that way, one of the short forms for that is the twin. Like the Gospel of Thomas, the author is Judas Didymus Thomas. Didymus means the twin. So much veracity that it was called the twin. The twin of who? That his veracity had this pair operative to such an extent that he could exchange cells with Jesus. No way it wasn't true. Read it for yourself. The stream of consciousness of the Gospel of Thomas is right there. Take yourself to it. The stream of consciousness of To the Lighthouse, or As I Lay Dying, or even use Ulysses if you want, is right there. The operative symbols structure by ordinal powers in two different ways, and the short form for them, classically in the wisdom tradition, is that when they seal and protect, the cardinal sequencing, they're amulets. And that when they release the differential capabilities, they're talismans. That's the way it is. So that symbols mediate between myth and magic. The ocean of language opens up like an open book. this side is mythic language and on this side is magic language. And it doesn't matter. Wherever you open it, it's like that. Wherever you open the book of life, because your symbolic presence is the mediator between that twin function which is always there. It's not a question of getting beyond one into the other. It's the adventure of having both together mediated by symbols, by symbolic self. Simple, everyday words for this is that symbols mediate experience and consciousness. And the only way that experience sculpts itself into radiant consciousness is through that symbolic mediation, which, if it is not gone through, becomes a veil, becomes a mirror, and all that you see, all that you do, is just increasingly regressive repetitions. People usually aren't ingenious enough to go into ideologies. They usually just fall into cults. This cult or that. It's the most common thing that there is. People pooled in stagnant cults. The process by which symbols work is a distillation. That's why it's usually called alchemy. It's a distillation. And that distillation puts spirit into the fluidity of the sequencing of experience. And the integration then is by powers of meaning, and the structure becomes the pattern known as an idea, the structure of thought, so that thought occurs in ideas. Structured patterns called ideas, so that the threads of experience, when they're woven together, those clothes are the ideas, those patterned fabrics, ideas. So that thought comes into play. Thought is an ordinal realm that integrates sequences of images and their correlates. Thought is not about images, but ideas. A mythic language moves by images. A magic language relates by symbols. A good example of a magic language, higher mathematics. Trigonometry is a magic language. Partial differential equations, a magic language. Visionary language. E equals mc squared. To name a thing is a descriptive imagery, and it relates to ritual, what we do, and myth, how we feel about what we do. But to name symbolically is definitive. It involves form, purpose, and it has to do with symbol and vision. Existence, when those kinds of names are given, then we have signs for phenomenon. But in essence, names are symbolic for noumenon. Try this for next week. There's a section. The section is in To the Lighthouse. It's section 17. It takes a little while to read through section 17. Try to see how far you can get in section 17. In this particular volume, it's about 30 pages. See if you can get through section 17. Stretch yourself out. If you can't afford to buy the book, steal it. If you can't find the time, steal that. And if you can't get here next week, shame on you. When you deal with Section 17, if you deal with Section 17, then I'll deal with Section 18. Make you a deal. Section 18 is only 5 pages. I can do that. Let's see if we can work that out. I'll try and make some copies of these notes.